So it's very nice to have you here, to see you. We are recording this, so we'll be able to share this later. To get started, I will mention also, we will have a chance later in the program to take some questions from audience members. So if at any time you have a question, just type it into the chat and we will get to that a little later in the program. To get us started, Jeffrey, I hoped you could tell us a little bit about your overall approach to the design of the magazine.
Oh, well, I had, you and I had spoken a little bit, but I've always been interested in print. I've collected a lot of everything from like late 19th century to mid-century print. Graphics is posters, advertising. A lot of it is the way that I think about organizing like compositions in my own work, even when it's beadwork. And so, yeah, when you invited me, it was kind of a very immediate yes. And when it came time to think about kind of how or what kind of designer would I be, I just realized that we have produced so much content, over the years, and especially with photographing works as an artist, we document our work, but also we communicate a lot in the studio, between myself and the studio team with, Photoshop images, like direction, color choices. We photograph everything that I collect. So all of the kind of tchotchkes that I've collected, vintage beadwork pieces that I've collected. And so that became kind of like my toolbox to work from, in terms of what to work with. And then I had to admit to myself that I really am a maximalist at heart. And as much as I wanted to kind of produce like a streamlined, kind of clean, design, that's just not really who I am. And so I really love a collaged. Lately, I've really been into kind of, like walls growing up in bars that were covered with writing and stickers and posters. And so I kind of decided to like just go with that aesthetic of like, let's just throw it all in there and layer it all up and let the relationships kind of fall where they may.
There was a moment early in the process that for me ended up being one of these defining moments when you said, I want people to look at the magazine and say, wow, that's nuts. And
Right.
I felt like that's kind of what we got with, some of these things. And
Yeah.
you're talking about the collections and that collage aspect. I thought it was interesting. As a visual artist, you certainly have plenty of your own images to share, and that you wanted to include some of these collections of yours and have them interact with your work. I thought was really interesting. To me, it illustrated a lack of a preciousness about your work.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about some of the collections that you have and how those interact with your work in the studio?
Yeah. I mean, I used to collect, well, I guess, even since like high school, like I collected beads. Whenever I would make a piece of jewelry and it fell apart, I would just put them in this cardboard box. And that cardboard box may actually not be with me any longer, but it was with me until not too long ago, the same cardboard box. And actually, you know what? It is still with me. It's in a drawer at home. And it probably still has some things from high school and college in it that haven't yet found a home. And then I started collecting things like vintage beadwork pieces, a lot of ceramic imagery of Native Americans, there's a period of me collecting only hand-carved wooden Indian images. I have a cigar store Indian, I have some smaller ones. And then textiles is a huge thing. And usually I'm collecting textiles because of their fabrication, but then lately it's become about print and imagery on the textiles. And there's a lot of different kind of interests in Native American imagery that kind of came into textile patterns. And so even the ones that maybe I've thought were kind of cheesy, I've begun collecting because I'm just kind of drawn to like what are the criteria that makes it cheesy, or what's the criteria that even brought it into the world in the first place. And I like to have them around me because I feel like they just keep my brain thinking about these things until I find an answer. And usually that's when they find their way into the work. And we've been scanning them. And so when we scan those fabrics and things, it really, I get to play with them in a way that it's not as charged as the object. It's literally like a batch of images, rescaling them, combining them. I think one of the images you showed there was, where there's like a transparency of multiple images coming together. And so that kind of process is really how I describe my practice. Like that image there, it's all entirely process. And I feel like I can't decide if I like something until I see it together. So, and I think with any artist, like, even there's works that are in progress right now that will go out into the world sometime in the next couple of years. Like, I know that this is like a seed of like, yet what's to come, so these kind of images and even people, the person on the left is Roxy Romero, who's a person who I've collaborated with more than once. And she serves as a muse for me for a number of reasons. And so I don't like to think of people as collections, but I think of them more as like informing the work,
When you're collecting things, are you driven by wanting things that can become parts of works, or is it a bigger thing for you of just having, because I know a lot of it is imagery or paraphernalia or toys that highlight natives in some way. Is it driven by wanting to use it, or just to help them?
I don't have to want to use it. I don't have to want, and I think, part of it is like so much of my process is relatively intuitive. So even when I'm collecting, even some, this is kind of an odd way to think about it, but it used to be like I would have like a budget, where I'd be like, okay, so let's look for things under $10. And then you're kind of surprised. And then sometimes I'm like, let's not think about a budget. Let's just give yourself like free, like, look at what you can find and open up to it not having a budget. And it doesn't really change. It's still very like impulsive. It's sort of like, I do know enough now that when I see something that is extremely unique, where I'm like, I've never seen anything like this before, I usually think about if I'll regret not getting it. So then I'll find a way to get it. And some stuff, I don't have to think too much about it. There's like a period of, with a lot of like protest movements, like going back into the 60s and 70s, like a lot of those posters were just photocopied, and so I've paid significant money for a photocopy, but I think it's so amazing that kind of DIY graphic exists, or that anyone kind of knew to like protect it and save it,
Yeah.
I may not even know initially who the people are, and then I'll spend some time researching, like, what was this protest about, or like, where did this patch come from? A lot of like body politic patches from the 60s and 70s. One of my favorite ones is like it's a patch with embroidery on it, and it's very floral, and it just says in lime green and hot pink, it says "fat is where it's at." And I'm just like, who designed this patch? Like who are they trying to speak to? And even the politics of that phrase, like, where do those words sit in our psyche today? So yeah, they're triggers.
The text fragments, I know a lot of times you use song lyrics in your works, and that music, you've said, has been very influential for you, as it has been for many of us. Can you tell us about some of the music that has been particularly resonant and that has showed up in your work, and how you use it?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that were kind of the most kind of easy for me to tap into were, of course, like disco, like house tracks, like soulful house, R&B, Motown. And those are all kind of genres of music that I've grown up with, whether it was, my parents would play them, or just sort of, they were kind of very easy. They came into my life very easily. and then there's things like gospel and spiritual hymns, and those are things which, you know, they're like destinations for me. They're not on the radio stations that I listened to growing up or anything, but I the words, like in particular when you get into gospel and spiritual hymns, you know, very few people write with such conviction, you know, that kind of like such determined, committed, faithful conviction. It's a quality of devotion in writing that is when you take it out of context and you take certain words away and you put it into painting or you put it into beadwork, like it just kind of spins it in a way that it becomes something altogether different. So those are probably some surprising places. And, you know, part of that, it actually didn't initiate, but when I discovered the work of Sister Karita Kent, you know, and her use of like cool cigarette ads and Wonder Bread ads and slogans for like, you know, anti-Vietnam slogans, and just her combining that with like biblical scripture was kind of mind-blowing for me, just to think that it's like, you know, and then you layer on top of that that, you know, she was a nun and like who came to her events and that it was free, and, you know, the kind of narrative of the prints themselves and her kind of workshops. So yeah, I think it's and then there's albums that I return to. I mean, I quote numerous times like Roberta Flack's album Quiet Fire. You know, it's like the gift that never stops giving. It's like,
Well, one thing that I thought was sort of funny, and maybe this isn't funny to anybody but me, but I'd be looking at some of your work and I'd see one of these fragments. I'm like, oh yes, that song. And then I try to start kind of playing it on my mental jukebox and I realize, oh no, I'm thinking of a different song. But that phrase was like enough to make me, I don't know, we're the same generation. So it takes me back to that music that I grew up with. And I thought it was interesting just that these fragments can feel, they're so universal that the
yeah,
fragments you select, some of them are very instantly identifiable with a particular song or period, but a lot of it I realized just has that little snippet, which in some form was in a lot of music,
right, right.
um, which makes it really resonant, I think, for your viewers.
Well, and I think for younger generations for whom they weren't listening to
Right.
these bands, and I think you know, I'm like, it's interesting. I think the words sound much more poetic than pop to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so it doesn't trigger like a pop cultural moment. It triggers like something introspective and like very kind of intimate and deep. And and so I mean, to me that's sort of like it's a very empowering thing. You feel like you can like put something out there and it has resonance. And the pop side of it to me, you know, like is a kind of extended dialogue, you know, to kind of talk about how pop, in my opinion, is still very deep and resonates in us. Like there's a reason why pop becomes pop. We're kind of hooked on it, and it kind of feeds us in a certain way. But yeah, I think the younger who have no idea coming from a lyric is pretty great.
I was this is a little aside, but we were listening to satellite radio and I had First Wave, like all
Yeah.
the 80s hits on. And I'm singing to these songs in the car, and my 13-year-old's like, man, you know a lot of songs. And I realized, no, it's just these are all the ones that I heard about 7,000 times growing up.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting about your use of text, like throughout the issue, we've got your alphabet, this
Yeah.
really abstracted alphabet. And for me, when you're looking at, you know, a piece like this
Mhm.
is, I don't even know what spread this is, but you don't instantly recognize that there's text there. And then it's like solving a little puzzle, figuring out what it says. Um, I I love how, you know, as somebody who works with words with a magazine, it's fun to see that abstracted alphabet and how that was another thing I was looking at with our kids. Um, you know, showing them once you start to recognize or when you see these shapes in in context of other ones, you do start to read it as an alphabet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I hope people will look. We've got through the issue, Jeffrey's entire alphabet is depicted. So um, there'll be different spreads that just have like a pair of letters or a little grouping of letters. There's some more C, D, E, F. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is your medium. You use a really wide variety of media, and I was wondering how you determine what medium to use. Is it dictated by the needs of a project, or there's a particular medium you want to use?
Well, you know, I mean, I guess a lot of it, there's like a longer answer to that, but my training is as a painter. And so for a long time, and I can't really say this anymore, but for a long time, everything came to me through the idea of painting. And then there was a period where I felt like I wasn't connecting with viewers who I was interested in talking to. And so my paintings were just reading as abstract and colorful and formal. And I was like, no, there's this very specific narrative that I'm interested in talking about. And that's what led me to bringing in things like beads and hide and fringe and jingles, and even like wall hangings and weavings and things like that. And but I think so that kind of expanded everything very quickly, right? And then I continued painting during that whole time, but I didn't actually start showing painting again until 2018. I did a show in New York with Sycamore Jenkins and did a painting show. And I was actually so nervous that I was going to lose that communication that I had built up. I told myself, I was like, you have to trust that people who are familiar with your larger practice will bring what they know about your larger practice to this. And the letters at that point were really because I have so much respect. And that sounds kind of corny, but that's true. I have so much respect for the context that I draw from, and that I didn't want all of the context to just become the background to like font.
Mm.
And I know that in from what I understand about like graphics, like that's usually what happens. If you put an image of a person or if you put a word, everything else falls into the background. So I wanted to find a way that there was like, it wasn't a clear distinction between figure and ground, but like how could they kind of merge, and I could kind of control that a little bit. So when the letter forms were made and they kind of were circulated between a few people here in the studio, we finally landed on the 26 letter forms. It sort of, it gave me freedom. It's like I can put whatever I want into this painting now, and it can be as like blatant as I want it to be, and somehow it still kind of unifies into like one surface. So that was a big deal. And actually this past year, because I still continued to use fonts, but this past year I had a font designed for the studio. So it's the Jeffrey Gibson studio font. And it was designed by an Indigenous designer in Montreal named Sébastien Aubin. And it was interesting. I talked to him and I said, have you ever designed a font for another Indigenous person? And he said, no, this is the first time. And I was like, that's it. It's like small things, but I love that we had a great conversation, and he really studied the letter forms and my work to develop the font. So yeah, I never knew I'd want that.
Well, this idea of moving away from painting and into some of these other genres, I also find pretty interesting, because I think a lot of the work that you've said first was really resonating people were these beaded pieces, these sculptures and textile pieces and things that, yeah, like the one we've got on the screen right now, that have so much dimension to them and this really tactile quality. And then I love that in these recent paintings, you just had a show at Sycamore Jenkins in New York and featured a lot of the paintings that we also have in the issue, that you do see that painterly quality. There's still that very graphic nature to it and the colors and the patterns, but when you look, you can see like drip marks or
Yeah.
those painterly touches. And I thought it was interesting the way you've now kind of incorporated that back into your practice.
Mhm.
It's very identifiable as your work, even as it's kind of shifting the medium um, a little away from what people have become very accustomed to seeing from you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I really, I knew that when I started that body of work, I was like, there's my work always hovers somewhere between painting and object. And so I was like, no, these are going to be paintings. Like, this is where I want to really like kind of spread my wings in terms of like what I love about painting and what I know painting is capable of, and color and kind of more nuanced uses of color, and also depth. The previous body of work was intentionally very flat. Like I wanted that like super flat graphic color and just like how these large shapes kind of play up against each other. And this time I was like, there's an atmosphere, like they need to kind of like move back and forth in relationship to each other. And so yeah, again, I felt really nervous like before that show opened, like, and you know, Scott from the gallery came to the studio and I was just really nervous. I was like, I don't know. It just feels like such a risky move. But then yeah, it felt great to see them all together and up.
And then what about these performative pieces? Like I've seen clips of videos that you've posted
Yeah.
where you've got these kind of installation pieces and then musicians and other people who are doing performance pieces of it.
Yeah.
How does that fit into the practice?
Well, originally the punching bags were probably the marker of like the transition of bringing in all these other materials. And most of those materials were coming from vendors who serve the powwow circuit. And so the beads, the fringe, the jingles, and things that are really, it's to me, that circuit is so interesting because it only serves the powwow circuit. Like
Mm.
there's no one you're not buying jingles for any other reason other than to make a jingle dress. And so I think that is brilliant, and I wanted to kind of highlight those materials. And they all come from dance. They all come from movement. Like the jingle is supposed to make sound. The fringe is meant to move. The ribbons are meant to move. And they're used on wearable garments that are meant to be danced in. So that's where I started thinking about performance. I mean, I thought about performance for other reasons too, but that was kind of the impetus to think about making a garment, inviting people to move in them, for myself to move in them. And then the performances just kind of emerged from there. And also people, most recently at Socrates Sculpture Park, the performers were the Indigenous Kinship Collective, which is queer and female identified, self-identified members of a collective here that they're activists, Indigenous activists. There's Laura Ortman, who is White Mountain Apache, a violinist. She's amazing. Emily Johnson, choreographer and dancer, and she worked with probably about 12 or 13 people. I'm going to guess. I think that's correct. And then Raven Chacon, and then MX Oops was our performer. And we had other people also assisting. But I think, to me, I guess in my world, the world that I imagine, that I draw from, it's multisensory. Like it's not just visual. There's sound, there's movement, there's community, there's narrative, there's storytelling. And yeah, I don't know. I know people comment all the time about how broad my practice is, but to me, it just makes total sense. Like I'm always like, I'm never too focused on why not, or I'm never too focused on why. I'm oftentimes focused on like, why not.
Well, one thing that seems to me a common thread that you've touched on a little earlier is how collaborative a lot of your work is when you're bringing in these other people to help realize the work, whether it's performers or people who are in your studio doing beading. I wonder if you could talk a little more about the labor intensive aspect of it and how you collaborate, what your studio life is like.
God. I mean, what's interesting is that my studio life is normal to me, but I know when people come to visit, people are really enchanted and don't want to leave. And part of it is they always just say they're like, I've never been someplace where it's like there's no tension in the air, like people are just going about doing their business. There's stuff happening all over this building. And I am truly amazed what comes out of this studio on a daily basis. There's
Can
about
we
13
interrupt for just a second and paint people a picture of what your studio is like? This isn't like a little closet somewhere.
No, no. So in 2012, I moved up to the Hudson Valley and I rented another space. And then this space that I'm currently in, I bought in 2016, and it's a turn of the century schoolhouse. So it would have been the K through 12. And that's like literally like Little House on the Prairie schoolhouse in the front. And then there was an extension in the 60s and another extension in the 70s. So in total, the building is just under 14,000 square feet. And so we have about 10 classrooms and then a gymnasium and a couple other kind of like administrative offices and then the original building. And so, we have like a beading room, we have a sewing room, we have the gymnasium, which is a painting room, we have a lounge. My husband has his studio here. We have a couple of tenants and we're very, we don't micromanage. I love that's one thing that anyone who works here probably has heard me say numerous times. I'm not interested in micromanaging anybody. I don't think it works. It needs to be a good match. It has to be somebody who enjoys working with their hands, doing repetitive tasks. There has to be something kind of grounding about that for people. And everyone here is an artist and has their own kind of artistic practice outside of the studio. I don't want people to take the work home with them. This is not the kind of job that you should be going home worried about or thinking about. I only like to hire people full time. It makes it easier for me to know kind of the consistency that we have. And if it's not a match, it's not a match. We try to be as transparent as possible. And yeah, we're about 13 people right now. And some people have been here. I've worked with some people since the earliest would be 2012 that someone's been working with me. And then the next one is kind of like 7 years. And some of our most recent hires are probably within the past year. We don't have a lot of turnover. And yeah, everyone used to be, things used to kind of move through different groups of hands. And now people tend to like if they're on a beading project, like they want to do the whole thing from beginning to end. And in addition to that, we kind of standardize things. So we have a kind of formalized language about how far the spacing is between beads. We just brought a new kind of beadwork into the studio, which is loom beadwork. We've always done hand beadwork, and now we do some things on a loom. So now there's like a learning curve. We've also learned as a group basketry. We've learned porcupine quill work and dyeing. We've learned, what was the other one? There was birch bark biting we learned last year. And yeah, I don't know. It's a kind of a crazy, wonderful place.
Well, the impression I have is that you first started having collaborators because you knew that the work was so labor intensive, you couldn't produce everything yourself. Sure. But it sounds like you're now in it because you really enjoy having collaborators. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of artists who I talked to over the years have been very like kind of solitary painters in their studio. And they're like, oh, I don't know how you handle it. Like, I just need to be by myself. Like, I can't have people talking to me. And I just think it's kind of in one way the trajectory that's happened, but it's also the one that I've encouraged, and so it's as it's moved in that direction, I have not stopped it. It's not like I've been like, oh, this is wrong. And I definitely think like we have a painting side of the studio, which is where I'm usually at, and then we have a handcraft side of the studio. And I'm really clear about, you know, any conversations between like craft and fine art and, you know, categorizing different kinds of things, but none of that exists here in this building, you know, and that's a decision that I've made. We don't think about these things in that way. And if anything, I kind of have decidedly organized my studio along at least my perception of what I think a kind of couture atelier might be like. Like originally, I imagined we'd all be walking around in white lab coats and have a DJ on the PA system, and like, yeah, I mean, that was kind of that was my fantasy, and now you know, everybody gets to be who they want to be when they come in here. If you're having a bad day and you want to wear headphones, you're more than welcome to. People play games, people just have conversations all day. There's always podcasts in different rooms going on. Yeah, it's a cool place.
Sounds very enticing. I can't wait for my visit. So
Yeah,
to
I
Hudson.
am proud of it. I'm very proud of it.
It seems like you guys haven't slowed down during the pandemic.
No.
How did it have an impact on your practice at all, or
Yeah,
not
for sure.
really?
It actually really did. Just we were really busy before the pandemic struck, and you know, so we were preparing for a show that was meant to open in May, and this would have been in, let's say, February, right? And so most of the work had already been in progress. There was, you know, for that show. So when the pandemic hit, I think that first week, I have a production manager who we adore named Jenny Getty. And Jenny and I spoke to everybody in the studio, and I made it really clear, look, I'm going to choose to keep the studio running. We're going to go as long as we can. I'm going to stay in communication with everyone who we work with. And Jenny actually started preparing kits, like take home work for people that they could do in their homes. So, and I continued coming in because I'm in my office oftentimes, and the building is big enough for, like, I think there was about 3 of us who were coming in. And Jenny would literally go and drop stuff off on people's doorsteps for zero contact, and they would drop it off on the doorstep and they'd bring it back. So that everything did slow down. And then there was, like, you know, all this online content generated. Everyone in the studio was doing some form of like voter registration, protests, marching, aid, like mutual aid programs here locally and in the city. We were doing a lot of fundraising efforts, which I also considered to be important to the studio. And so we had a lot of those conversations. That we had differences in the studio that I felt it was important to kind of foster those conversations as part of our community here. And then there was video projects that came up, and I think we ended up shooting, well, with Socrates Sculpture Park, that was already in process. And so because they were in New York City Park, they could remain open. So we went ahead and completed the ziggurat structure. We did the performances for video as opposed to for an audience. So we ended up producing 2 videos through there. And then I think I produced 2 additional videos, one for the Wattis Institute and one for the Palm Springs Art Museum. So it was like a boot camp for video because we couldn't do it how we normally would do it. We had to block it out. So we were working outdoors safely, organizing so there was never more than a certain number of people in the room. Everybody was masked. And yeah, it was exhausting. It was exhausting, but I just remember feeling, you know, like you know, I mean, it's kind of hard, right? This is the first time maybe I'm putting words to sort of what a bizarre year it was from the studio perspective. But for me to feel really committed to keeping everybody employed, and you know, Hudson has a lot of service industry here, and so a lot of the people who work here, their friends are in service industry and we're going on unemployment. And you know, I said to them, I was like, look, if you feel like you need to go do something else right now, we fully support you. Like, you know, no hard feelings in any way. Like, you go do what you feel is important. And but ultimately, we didn't have to let anybody go. We made it through the year. and now we're, things are obviously returning back to something similar to what it was before.
Well, it looked like I saw the pictures from when you guys went to Sycamore Jenkins to see your show there before it closed. Was that your whole studio team who went?
That's the whole studio team plus like partners and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a bigger group than who's in the building daily.
That must have felt like part of a reemergence celebration to be able to actually get there to the gallery and everyone see the work in place. And
well, we normally do that. What felt actually great was to actually have things like leave the building when they said they were going to leave the building, and like the show opened, and things like the framing happened, like, because leading up to that we were like, well, it's not going to happen, so we started having all this work just sort of sitting around the studio, and that felt like the gears were like stopping,
yeah,
because we're just not we're always very busy, but it usually feels great just to kind of be able to like witness everything kind of like moving all the time. And in this case, um, it just wasn't for about 9 months.
and there's some shows on the horizon, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Where's some places people might go to see some of your work coming up?
Well, next, actually, the structure that was at Socrates Sculpture Park opens at the De Cordova Museum. I never say that correctly. It's like De Cordova.
I've never had to say it. I've only read it.
I have to like slow down when I say it, but De Cordova opens on the 4th of June. So that's right around the corner. And then there's a gala there on the 5th. So I'll go up there for that. And the performances will be by Laura Ortman, and there'll be another performance by Eric Paul Reach, who is a young artist from Gallup, New Mexico. And Laura is from Brooklyn. And then I'll do an interior show in the galleries there that'll open in October, which is new sculpture and then new paintings, works on paper. And then tomorrow, in fact, a show opens at the Newberry Library in Chicago, which is part of the Smart Museum and the MacArthur Foundation are doing this really expansive project of exhibitions. And so I've been working with some of the paintings in the Newberry Library's collection. And it looks fantastic. I have to admit, that's been tough to complete as well, but it's all there. I keep getting images of installation right now, and I think it is a beautiful show. And we're producing a book to go along with that. And then what happens next? September, I'll open a show here at Art Mai in the Hudson Valley, and that will be showing some video, some quilt works that have never been shown before, painting, and drums and garments will be shown there. And then November in Chicago again, the gallery I work with, Kavi Gupta Gallery, will be doing a solo show there. And I think that brings us through the end of the year.
That's a lot of shows.
Yeah.
But lucky for all of us who are out in the world, and it gives us chances to look at it. When you mentioned the publication, I assume that was an exhibition catalog that you were just referencing?
I think we're kind of doing like different kinds of, to me, I feel like the way that my work is written about is so important to me. And I used to feel like when somebody wanted to do a catalog, I guess I was just like, I was like pleased. I was like, oh, that's great, And then I realized this is an opportunity for me to like work with writers and essayists and even designers to think about like how are we really like presenting the work. And so it is a catalog in a sense, but we're also showing a lot of the reference material. So in this case with the Newberry Library, it's these Burbank paintings, which were turn of the century kind of classic oil portraits of Native Americans. And I realized when I started working with them that basically I find these portraits really triggering, and I found them really frustrating and upsetting. And part of it was because these portraits don't actually acknowledge what these individuals were going through or everything that they had just lost. And when we were looking into the details of when they were painted, like it's even worse than I imagined, So I was like, these are just really triggering uh, paintings that are actually not being interpreted according to what really happened, you know? So my iterations of them are basically me kind of reinventing those paintings. And then there was also when I worked at the Field Museum when I was in my early 20s in the 90s, and there was an acquisition into the anthropological collections that was from a ceremony, a celebration, and in let me see, is it Alaska? It was Alaska, and anyways, the gifts that were at that celebration included things like Skull tobacco, diapers, Whoppers, Doritos, Pepsi, cigarettes, and it was contentious because people were like, "Why would we bring something into a collection that we could go buy at Duane Reade?" Um, and so anyhow, so long story short, all of those cards had to have a drawing made of these items, and I've turned those drawings into a wallpaper. So it's like this immersive,
Cool.
incredibly bright wallpaper made from these drawings of this acquisition in 1991. And then those turn of the century paintings are hung on top of that.
Well, when you were talking about those paintings, it was reminding me when we, during the design process on the magazine, and we were talking about some of the works in your collections, you were mentioning that these depictions are always of, and there's some in the magazine of, you know, like these beautiful exotic women, like, or, you know, something like this, where the depictions of what's going on, even when it's suggesting something maybe not so great, maybe there's conflict there. And this one too, Chris, I don't know if
Yeah, that's a
page
great.
75. Obviously, it's not real great, and I guess she's being used as a messenger, but the depictions are very romanticized, and I think it is interesting the way you've embraced some of these images and paraphernalia that you found over the years and recontextualized it um, in ways that, you know, it's beautiful to look at still, but it's a little more jarring
Yeah.
to see it in these other contexts.
Yeah, I think, like I have a lot of things that I've collected that I think, you know, I would call them racist. They are
Yeah.
racist. I would call them racist imagery. And I know when it came time to like, oh, did we include that in the publication and for All Story? And I just thought, part of it is about the transparency of what I've collected. And and having a conversation like we're having today gives me the opportunity to say, it doesn't mean that I celebrate these images in any way. It's acknowledging that they exist. And it's acknowledging that I have them around me so that I can over time determine what my relationship is to them. That's why I have them. And in no way do I even know what my relationship to them is. It changes over time. But, I know in my going back to my 20s, I used to get really triggered by this kind of imagery and it would bring up this incredible anger. And then I realized one day, I was just like, wait, hold on a minute. Like, is this actually who I see myself as? And I was like, no, I don't. And so I was like, so if I don't see myself as this image, like, can I separate myself from it? And so to me, it's a, they're images that people don't show because of our uncomfortability with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of more in favor of being like, we can acknowledge the kind of atrocities of history. It doesn't mean we're celebrating them. It doesn't mean that we're even giving them permission. But to acknowledge them is at least to me, it's a step in the right direction of like getting to the next place of articulating like what we feel about them or what to do with them.
I was just noticing the time. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I just want to check the chat here and see if there are some questions. There are a lot of people celebrating you, and somebody's commenting you're an inspiration. This person is an art teacher, and her students love your work. Somebody liked the reference to Rita Kent and the use of type, the way you've incorporated that. Seeing some of your works in exhibitions. Okay, no questions. That means I get more for myself. So one thing that we had talked about, again, as we were talking about designing the magazine, you said part of what was appealing to you was you have your own interest in creating some kind of publication, and you were referencing the font that you had designed earlier for the studio. I wonder if you could talk a little more about your ideas for some kind of publishing project.
Well, I'm working with an editor right now on a book, which I guess we're tentatively titling. Working title is An Indigenous Present, and it's basically, I thought it was about one thing, and then when I started talking about it with this person, I realized it's basically all the people who I've been watching for the past 10 years, and we're just kind of like quantifying the past 10 years. Native artists who, when I see their work, I feel like, oh, these are my people. Like this is like, I wish everyone knew about them, because these are the people who I want to be contextualized within. And so that's really what, kind of when I boiled it down, that's what had happened. Because it wasn't always about necessarily this artist's entire work, but it was like these experiences of like, I remember seeing, a piece of Rebecca Belmore's, or I remember attending one of her performances, or, any number of artists. And so, and also like I realized that there's this, this isn't necessarily meant to be a sort of like directory of Indigenous artists. That's not what this is. This is a kind of edited, curated images of artworks that have influenced me, or I think are incredibly important. And I realized that the larger art world may not know about them. And so, yeah, that's the book project. And it's quite huge because, I want to work, I think that we've put the number at like 75 artists.
Oh, wow. That is huge.
Yeah, it's huge. And, and it's also about asking each one of those artists to direct us collectively towards people who they're paying attention to. And so it's just this kind of, hopefully this kind of like unfolding of this network. Because I think a lot of people think that, when we use the word Indigenous or Native American, it's such a collective, but we're so different from each other, and we're coming all from such different tribal aesthetics, kind of boundaries, politics, different points in history even. And so I feel like there's nothing to be gained by us being so broadly described, under like a few words. So yeah, that was where the book came from. And in fact, I knew I was going to do the book when I had the font designed. And in fact, Sebastian Aubin will be the designer. So he's designed the font, but he's also designing the book.
Oh, that's great. I see there's a question here asking if you could talk about your perspectives on monuments and memorials.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think monuments are impossible. I think that they're really flawed because they really, the way that we've historically determined when a monument is successful, it's because it speaks to kind of like a very narrow perspective on something, on a historical event, right? And oftentimes like that kind of public approval of the monument is coming from, again, a very narrow slice of the public. And so to me, in terms of like imagery, representations of Native people in monuments, it oftentimes kind of locks us into a historical perspective and kind of disallows kind of present day kind of acknowledgement. So, but on the other hand, I think that it's a part of our collective history that monuments exist. I think it's a part of our kind of, artistic history about why they exist, what the attempts were. I hope just in 2021, the critique of monuments or what they need to become going forward, we can see as like clearly outdated and like clearly antiquated, not in line with the progressive way of like looking at different voices and like honoring different narratives and kind of expansive histories. They just don't accommodate it in the way that we've kind of historically described monuments or memorials. And you know, for me, I think whatever form of memorializing or monumentalizing things that allow for them to transform with context and transform with history as it moves forward into the present, into the future. I think there's a lot of opportunity with digital. There's a lot of opportunity with projection. There's a lot of opportunity with impermanent monuments and sculptures, and also things that kind of environmentally are sustainable, you know. But as far as like historic monuments, to me, they're like artifacts. Like I just want to play with them, you know.
There's a related question about the Socrates Park piece, and a question about if you could talk a little more about that piece and how it maybe relates to this idea of contemporary monuments.
Well, it was funny because the piece itself, well, the history of the Mississippian mounds goes back again to my 20s, which is when I discovered Mississippian culture. And then I realized that like my tribe, the Mississippi Choctaw, would have emerged out of Mississippian cultures. And then I was at the Field Museum, so I was in this anthropological and archaeological context where I was like, why does nobody know about this? Why is this not something that we all know about? And from an archaeological perspective, they were like, oh, well, it would rewrite history. We had to acknowledge that there was a fully realized civilization here pre-contact. That's not the narrative that's out in the world. So it would radically shift everything. So then like really quickly, I just kind of realized I was like, wow, that's amazing. Like there was this whole other kind of like chapter before the one that we're taught. And the mounds are astounding. They have that same kind of impact on me of like any other kind of huge pre-Columbian architecture where you're like, how was this built? How was this possibly built? You know, and the earthworks that exist in the middle of this continent, you know, it was like you could only see from aerial views, like the serpent mounds and things. So I was like, how do we not know about this? How are they not teaching this in art school? And so when Jess Wilcox from Socrates contacted me, she actually didn't tell me the theme was monuments. She asked me to do a solo show at Socrates. And because of the space, the ziggurat immediately came to my mind. I was like, here's my opportunity. And I know that space. I've seen so many exhibitions, and I think it's a really tough space. You need something that's big and marks that space. And you need to be able to see it the minute you arrive at the park. So I talked to her about it, and she was on board immediately. And then we started talking about it as a monument. And I've always been drawn to things like speakers' corners and things where, you know, there's no kind of censorship given to who comes and says what they want to say on it. So I thought, we're going to put this ziggurat here. Many people are not going to know what in the world it is. So we have to inform it somehow. And so that's where programming became part of like any object gains its meaning through how it's used and how it exists and what context it exists in. We're going to create an object, and then we're going to create a narrative that informs it. And that's what the programming is, you know? So everyone's biography who interacts with that is important to what this means. And I wanted to focus on people who have historically been identified as peripheral cultures, you know, and that is a whole nother conversation. And I think my statement says how much I hate the word minority, because, you know, the feeling of being among people like you, when to feel what it's like to feel the majority is such an empowering feeling. To look at people who share your features, who have the same skin tone as you, it's just like this radical awakening. And so yeah, and I think Jess was great. She totally got on board, and it was really successful in terms of like people's understanding and appreciation of all of that. And now it's continuing, and hopefully we'll go on to have another iteration after its time at De Cordova.
Well, we've got 1 minute left in our talk today. So I just want to take that time to thank you so much not only for being here today. I know it's been a busy schedule. I think you wrapped up classes yesterday at Bard. Um, but also for your work on the magazine. It's such an honor when we get to work with people whose own art we really admire and appreciate. And we don't pay our artists, so it's really a generous thing when people agree to be guest designers of the magazine. We couldn't be more thrilled with the issue that you created. I think it's stunning. I hope people who don't have it yet will visit our website and pick one up. The URL again is all-story.com. So please pick up a copy of Jeffrey's, pick up a couple more for some friends, and subscribe. We'd love to have more people as part of our community. And Jeffrey, we're grateful you're part of it. So
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I really enjoyed it.
And thank you to everybody who made time in the middle of their Thursday to join us today. We will have a recording available. So if you want to watch it again, if you want to share it with a friend, or for anyone who missed it live, that'll be available and we'll promote that as well. Thank you so much to everyone and have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You off?
I think so.